And now it's good afternoon to Jim O'Hagan, who has for us the story of a distinguished man who was present at the launch of the BBC here in Belfast.
Hello again, Walter. In the late 1940s, gaunt, distinguished-looking man, 6'5" in height, walked into James Johnston's butcher's shop in Sandy Row in Belfast and asked James to sing with the Sadler's Wells Opera Company. James accepted and went on to become an international opera singer. The man was Tyrone Guthrie, the celebrated theatre and opera director. Tyrone Guthrie was born William T. Guthrie on the 2nd of July 1900 at Tunbridge Wells in Kent. His father, a Scot, Dr. Thomas Guthrie, was a doctor in the local hospital there, whilst his great-grandfather was the Reverend Thomas Guthrie, sometime Moderator General of the Kirk of Scotland. There is a statue of him in Princes Street, Edinburgh, hard by the Scott Memorial, I'm told. Tyrone's mother was Nora, daughter of a distinguished general in the British Army, Sir William Power, who was Irish and who also lived in Tunbridge, but had property in Ireland at Annaghmakerrig in County Monaghan. Sir William's father had been Tyrone Power, the famous Irish actor, who was drowned when his ship, the SS President, was returning from America in 1841. The US actor Tyrone Power, who starred in many films in the 1940s and 50s, was a cousin of Tyrone Guthrie. So, Walter, we can see where Tyrone Guthrie's name came from, and that acting was in his blood. The Guthrie family, along with the grandfather, and which also included Peggy, Tyrone's sister, came on holidays each year to County Monaghan for 6 or 7 weeks. And from an early age, Annaghmakerrig, near Newbliss, was his spiritual home. In fact, he looked forward as a boy with eager anticipation to these trips, when the servants came as well, and where they were welcomed to the big house, with its opportunities for boating and other country pastimes. After attending the local dame school in Tunbridge conducted by Miss Mabel Slan, Tyrone went off to Wellington College in Berkshire as a boarder. Whilst there he learned a love for Shakespeare, which he put to such good use later in life, and in 1918 was called up in the Irish Guards and the war against Germany. The armistice of November 1918, much to the relief of his mother, saved him from going to the front, to where he had been provisionally assigned from January 1919. Guthrie spent from 1919 to 1924 at St John's College, Oxford, where in the summer of 1924 he came down from with a 2-1 in history. He was a steady but not brilliant student, and at university had developed a real passion for the theatre, both as an actor, a writer and a producer of plays. He often used nom de plumes such as Oedipus Bing, Tannhäuser Finn and Tothill Block. He joined the Oxford University Dramatic Society and had the reputation for having a fine speaking and singing voice. In the summer of 1924, he applied to the newly created BBC and hoped to get a job in radio in either London or Edinburgh. Instead, he was posted, somewhat to his disappointment, to the new station in Belfast, called 2BE, as a producer of talks, plays, and as junior announcer. His voice had the distinction of being the first heard on the new station on the 15th of September 1924, when he was heard over the air with, "Hello, hello, this is 2BE, the Belfast station of the British Broadcasting Corporation calling." The local wireless orchestra, conducted by Godfrey Brown, played the national anthem, and then a technical hitch caused the transmission to stop for 15 minutes. When it resumed, there was a short local news bulletin, followed by an orchestral concert, which began with Sullivan's overture De Ballo and lasted for about 90 minutes. There followed an address by the station director, and then the station closed down for the evening. Guthrie's observations on the other staff at the time are interesting and rather funny, if a bit priggish in places. The station director was Major Walter Montague Douglas Scott. Guthrie said in an early letter to friends that he didn't seem very efficient, but rather nice. Scott was relieved of his position in 1926 by John Reith, so maybe Tyrone's observations were accurate. The station director would have run up against opposition from today's fair employment laws in his recruitment policy. It sounds humorous in this age of legal correctness, but apparently he asked Godfrey Brown, the station's first head of music, to go and get, as he put it, 2 nice, well-educated girls as typists and private secretaries, one for yourself and Mr. Thompson, and one for me. He added, I don't want to advertise it's such a nuisance sorting them out. Major Thompson was the senior assistant and announcer at the time. Guthrie spoke of Brown as being very kind to him, but with a touch of class consciousness described him as lowish class. Regarding Ingram, the station engineer, Tyrone wrote that at times he behaved like a 5-year-old child. Tyrone soon got down to work and met people from all walks of life in his business of arranging talks and programmes, from local business chiefs to shipyard workers. Lord Craigavon he met, and he reminded him of a cattle dealer. In the early days, the first studio was in a converted old linen warehouse at 31 Linen Hall Street, which was actually being converted as Guthrie arrived, so Tyrone had to improvise quite a lot for sound effects for his dramatic productions. In later life, he stated he learned much on his feet as he went along in Belfast, which stood him in good stead for the rest of his career. The broadcasting studio in Linen Hall Street was heavily draped, so as to minimise unwanted sound. Guthrie spoke of the cold, hard, glaring light. He said that he often felt a sense of choking. Apparently a vegetable plant was installed to provide ozone. He wondered if anyone was listening to the broadcasts out there. He called them the Cat's Whiskers Brigade. On the air he often was known as Tyrone Power, and was the much-loved Uncle Will of the First Children's Hour, a position incidentally he did not want initially. He got letters from the public. One such advised him to take care of the cold he had. It mentioned him speaking at the microbe and not the microphone, and was signed the mother of the family. Despite Guthrie's loving of the countryside around Belfast, I don't feel he ever really settled in here. Of course, he always had a yearning to move on from whatever situation he found himself in. And so in August 1926, he moved to Scotland, based in Glasgow, as the producer of the Scottish national players there. This gave him an opportunity to develop his talents in that direction and to run his own theatre. The Ulster Literary Theatre had, before he left, wanted him to be a producer with them. It's tempting to speculate how Ulster drama would have developed to his advantage if he'd taken up this offer and had stayed for a considerable period of time. The Scottish national players did not enjoy its association with him for long, for domestic grief caused him to sever connection with this troupe early in 1928. Tyrone received word that his father was dangerously ill. He died in February 1928, and that his mother was going blind, so he returned to the south of England. He resumed his connections with the BBC in a freelance capacity and wrote microphone plays, as they were called then. These were called The Squirrel's Cage and The Flowers Are Not For You to Pick. He renewed his acting friendship with Flora Robson, who later became the celebrated Dame Flora of renown, and in fact proposed marriage at one stage to her, but she declined his offer. Around about this time, too, he renewed his acquaintance with Judy Brereton, who originally hailed from Tunbridge Wells. The Guthrie and Brereton families had long known each other. Judy and Tyrone did since he was 11 years of age, and the courtship began. In 1930, Tyrone's wanderlust took him to Montreal, where he became controller of a radio station called, curiously enough, the Canadian National Railway Station. Here he produced Canadian historical plays for broadcasting, and in the position experimented greatly with sound effects, often going to great effort to produce just the right background atmosphere. Guthrie said he visited stores such as Woolworth's to buy inexpensive but effective sound effects. In 1931, he returned to the British Isles and on the 5th of September married Judy in Acabog Parish Church, County Monaghan, near his beloved Anna McCarrig. The young couple returned to London, and Tyrone had his first success in the West End when he produced J.B. Priestley's first play, Dangerous Corner, at the Lyric Theatre. He also wrote and directed a play of his own called Follow Me. It was in these early 30s, whilst producing Shakespeare's Love's Labour Lost, that he came to the attention of Lillian Bayliss, who at that time was the licensee manager of the Old Vic in South London, the famous so-called People's Theatre, which specialised in Shakespeare and the classical repertoire. Miss Bayliss, who had run the Old Vic for 34 years by then, and had also managerial control over Sadler's Wells in North London, where plays and opera were performed, engaged Tyrone at a salary of £700 per year as producer for the 1933-4 season. From the beginning of their relationship, Tyrone demonstrated that he certainly was not overawed by Miss Bayliss, who had the reputation for being a formidable character. In that first season, he convinced her to employ the international film actor Charles Laughton in a Shakespearean role in a number of the Bard's plays, at a salary of £20 per week. £20 per week for an actor at the Old Vic was unknown in that era, when all the famous actors and actresses vied with each other to have the privilege of playing the famous theatre. Lillian felt that to employ so-called stars was against her whole egalitarian approach to running this theatre, which stressed its appeal to the ordinary man in the street, with admission prices to match. But Guthrie persuaded her, and anyway Laughton wanted to gain experience in Shakespearean acting techniques. Laughton's stay at the Old Vic was not entirely a happy one, despite a considerable rise in receipts at the box office. He left after only one season. Guthrie's contract was not renewed then as well. But Tyrone returned in 1936 and in time became the director of drama and opera too at Sadler's Wells. One of his heroes was Toscanini, the Italian maestro of opera. This state of affairs lasted more or less till the end of the Second World War and the bombing of both theatres. During these years, on and off, Guthrie was closely associated as a producer and director with all the major theatrical stars of the day. Names like John Gielgud, Michel Saint-Denis, Laurence Olivier, Alec Guinness and Ralph Richardson spring to mind, but there were many more. Tyrone visited Ireland whenever he could, but one time in the middle 30s had a narrow escape from death. He and Judy visiting his sister Peggy and her husband, one of the butlers of County Kilkenny, when their chartered plane crashed on take-off on its way back to London. The Guthries climbed out unhurt. Tyrone lived for the theatre. he was a workaholic. As an example of this, during the worst of the bombing of London, when the Old Vic was based in the provinces, he virtually lived in Sadler's Wells and often bedded down at night time there, doing all sorts of mundane jobs and revealing a real flair and talent for organisation and administration. As far as theatre was concerned, he was a driven man, very painstaking in his production and direction of whatever he was involved in. People often remarked how much of a jack-in-the-box he was during rehearsals, 1 minute directing from the front stalls, the next shouting instructions from the wings or the gods, often racing up and down stairs in the process, always urging on his players to become as fully involved as possible in the drama they were enacting. They were not just playing the part, but had to be the character as well. He would spend hours and hours in perfecting his work, and this extended to having the right set design, costumes and lighting. In this he was like some others I have spoken of in the past, people in different fields of activity, like Harry Ferguson and Sir John Lavery. In the late 1940s, Tyrone severed his managerial connections with the Old Vic and Sadler's Wells, but continued to produce plays and opera at these venues and in other places too, like the Met in New York, where he put on Carmen. He was very much involved with the 1951 Festival of Britain and recruited a new Northern Ireland festival company and brought 3 Ulster plays to London. The Passing Day by George Shields, Danger Men at Work by John D. Stewart, and The Sham Prince, adapted by Jack Loudon. In the process, it brought to London actors like Joe Tumulty, Alan McClelland, J.G. Devlin and Patrick McGee, who had all become part of the London theatre and film scene. The Passing Day was particularly successful. The sets were designed by Tanya Mosejewicz, who was closely associated with Guthrie's work for many years. Walter, perhaps the one part of Guthrie's life which will always be remembered is his setting up in Stratford, Ontario, of what became a famous Shakespearean theatre and company there. This was in 1953, when Tyrone constructed the theatre in a tent-like structure, which enabled the plays to be performed with the audience closely packed around the players, just like it was in Shakespeare's own time. Guthrie returned to Canada to direct for several seasons in the 1950s, and eventually a permanent theatre was built. Tyrone Guthrie's mother died in July 1956 at Annaghmakerrig, where she had lived since 1927. Mother and son had always been close, and he was shattered with grief. He now inherited the house and lands there. Whilst recovering from a sinus operation in a Belfast hospital in 1960, he suffered a heart attack, but the experience did not force him to cut back much from his globe-trotting activities. In 1962, he founded the Minneapolis Repertory Theatre in the United States, which turned out to be a great success, as was his work in the Phoenix Theatre in New York earlier, where Gilbert and Sullivan, I think, was produced. He was knighted in 1961. Now living in Annaghmakerrig, when not jetting around the world directing plays or giving lectures, his strong social conscience made him consider how he might halt the upward trend of unemployment in the New Bliss area. Accordingly, he and a local man, Joe Martin, set up a jam factory there. In time they had upwards of 30 people employed in all aspects of the process. Guthrie was fully in his element with this, and threw his coat off like the rest. The old railway station at New Bliss formed the main centre, along with the freight shed nearby. But as time wore on, the venture was not a success, and in 1969 its affairs had to be wound up, much to Sir Tyrone's great disappointment and financial loss. Back in 1963, he had become the Chancellor of Queen's University. But in 1964, he annoyed many people, but delighted others when he advocated the scrapping of the border. There was quite a to-do about this, and Guthrie was actually asked to explain himself by the university authorities. On the occasion, he kept his distance by eating his lunch from his car, but he kept his position as Chancellor. As he grew older and having no children, he became more and more concerned about the fate of Anna McCarrig after he and his wife's deaths. His original intention, I have read, was to give it and its land to Seamus McGorman and his family. McGorman was the land steward of the place. But in this intention, he encountered opposition from his sister Peggy, whose share in the property he had bought out after their mother's death. The matter remained unresolved, and for a time he entertained the idea of leaving the place to the youth of Ireland as a place of reconciliation where the young from both sides of the border could meet and fraternise. The Youth Hostel Association dallied on these ideas. Finally, he willed the house to the Irish Ministry of Finance and the lands to the McGorman family. The house was to be used as a retreat for Irish writers and artists. Queen's University was to get the house if the Department of Finance would not agree to run the place for this purpose. It did agree. Guthrie suffered a second heart attack in December 1969, again in Belfast, causing him to slow up quite a bit. However, in 1970, he enjoyed what turned out to be his last major theatrical triumph. This was the putting on of Oedipus Rex in Sydney, Australia. It was a scintillating performance. Oedipus Rex by Sophocles he considered to be the most perfect play ever constructed. Tyrone Guthrie died on the 15th of May 1971 at Anna McCarrig, and he was buried a few days later, again like his forebears, in Anna Bog Churchyard. At the memorial service in the Actors' Church, St. Paul's Covent Garden, the eulogy was given by Sir Alec Guinness, who said the strength of his personality has been a vitalising influence on all who knew him. You met him, Walter, shortly before his death, didn't you?
That's right, because he came into the studio to record a Speaking Personally programme, and ironically, I was away actually when it was broadcast a few days later to hear before it went out that he had just died, and with the permission of the family the programme went ahead.
That was very sad. James Forsyth wrote the authorised biography of Tyrone Guthrie in 1976, published by Hamish Hamilton. Tyrone also wrote his autobiography called A Life in the Theatre. Forsyth's highly readable book calls Guthrie a phenomenon, both as a man and as a theatrical person, a comet seen once in a century. There is no doubt he was highly gifted, a bohemian in many ways, a man nearly always seen wearing a dark overcoat. He was a person of perfection in things of the theatre, rather English in manner, shy and boyish, yet one of great companionability, never slow to admit a mistake. Guthrie was always anxious to create the complete theatrical performance. He saw the stage as a deep ritual with appropriate spiritual and social overtones. There was always to his work a sense of arousing celebration. Tyrone Guthrie was one of that small but distinguished band of people from these shores who made a great impact worldwide in his chosen field.
Jim O'Hagan. Well, looking ahead to the second half of Love 40 today, I'll be joined by Stephanie Sim-Doran from the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds. Stephanie will be reporting on the big garden bird watch held a couple of months ago, telling us what the birds are doing at the moment and how to encourage birds to visit the garden. And as well as Stephanie, Roy Irvine will be here, this time with the girl next door, who I think you probably recognise as Doris Day, who had a succession of hit records in the 1950s. Well, music up to news time at 4 o'clock comes from Carol Gibbons, often thought of as essentially English, but in fact he was an American musician who came to England in 1924. In the late 20s, he'd established himself with a number of London hotel orchestras, including the Savoy Orpheans, and he became one of the most popular broadcasters of the 1930s and 40s, playing what was described by some people as sophisticated jazz. Not only a very successful band leader, but a great pianist too. And that's how we hear him now, with a piano solo version of Body and Soul. Not quite on his own, because with him he has Reg Pursglove on violin and Laurie Payne on alto sax. And I'll be back after the news at 4 o'clock.